heat and drought. Rainfall that's grown unpredictable. Storms of catastrophic power. And rising sea levels. Climate change is hitting Africa hardest of all, although the continent has contributed least to the crisis. Crops are rotting in fields. Herders can no longer find water for their animals. And the COVID-19 pandemic could soon drive another 40 million people in sub-Saharan Africa into extreme poverty. For many, the only option is to leave their homes. But the vast majority of migrants don't head for Europe. Most are on the move within Africa itself. In sub-Saharan Africa alone, it's thought that around 86 million people could be forced to flee the effects of climate change by 2050. How can we protect and support those who are displaced? How can livelihoods and living conditions be improved sustainably for those who remain?
Animals can't even live here to protect.
And how can the international community come together to face the immense challenges ahead? It's time to act.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to this conference on climate change and migration. Today, we're considering the African perspective as we ask if we're at a point of no return. My name is Christine Mundwa, and I like to say that I hail from the great Zimbabwe. It's good to be in your company today. Greetings from a very chilly morning in the Berlin capital. It's wonderful to have your company here today. At this time, I want to introduce to you some of the organizers of this conference. These people have a stake in this conversation, and I wanted us to just start out by essentially getting into their heads and establishing what it is that they are in it for, essentially. What is their stake in this conversation? What did they hope to come out of this conference? After all, they have brought us all here together. Mr. Knipe, I do want to come to you first here because we're having this conversation about migration, and we're being told, at least you've come into this conversation establishing the fact that migration is not just a problem, it's a fact that doesn't only have negative impact. So just your input here on your stake in this conversation as we take off.
A warm welcome also from my side to the participants of this conference from the Stiftung Mercator, which I'm standing here for as a director for integration. I think that your question is touching some of our main topics that we have in the foundations. We are very interested in that matter, because we deal with both aspects. One is migration, and the other one is climate protection. But we have, for strategic reasons, not yet brought these two topics together in one aspect that we deal with concretely due to some strategic aspects that we are dealing with. So we are focusing on the change of mindset in our country and in Europe, and we're focusing on policy matters and on scientific innovation. But nonetheless, the outcome of this conference and the cause of climate change as a cause for migration is of a great interest for our foundation, because we're very interested in developing, of course, further aspects of that matter for the future. And I'm quite sure that this aspect is of a rising importance. We saw this last year when we had that topic in relation to the African continent, as we fund the Experts Council for Integration and Migration. And this year's assessment, in focusing on a topic that they are dealing with each year, was about migration from Africa. And they said, and they stated, that climate change is a rising aspect coming towards Europe. And of course, it's a matter that Europe has to deal with. So we are very much looking forward to the results of the conference. And we are wishing all of you a fruitful exchange and discussion. And I'm sure this topic that you are dealing with today is only the beginning of a huge topic for the future of Europe. So good luck for this day.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Winfried, for those remarks leading on into the conversation. Goran, I do want to invite you into the conversation now, because you've come into this and you've told us that climate change migration is not just a challenge that needs to be fought, but as an adaptation strategy. And I'm very keen to know what that is. So Goran, the floor is now yours. Goran comes to us from the Open Society Foundations.
Thank you very much. And just to observe that I lead our European programs, but I here speak on behalf of our entire foundation that has a significant presence in Africa, and also a special dedicated program on migration. First, I really want to congratulate Ingrid and the organizers for the timing, because it really, this conference comes super timely as we're gearing up for the Climate Ambition Summit, which will be co-hosted by United Nations, UK and France, in partnership with Chile and Italy. And I hope that this conference will really affect a bit the agenda and the issues that will be discussed on that summit. What you mentioned exactly, we at OSF, we really want to move away from treating this as a problem. And I have to say, in Europe, we're probably guilty as charged, because most of the time we talk basically about the environmental change as the cause for migration, and we frame it as a problem. And we rarely look at this as an opportunity, as an adaptation strategy. And I think this is what I would like to leave you as you will be going into these conversations. We really need to look at that. And I'm so glad that your intro movie actually mentioned that most of the problems are on the continent of Africa, and adaptation strategy is needed there, not only here in Europe. And I think not only the discourse, but as well the solutions will be different, and migration will be seen as actually as a positive strategy to help alleviate some of the problems that are caused by environmental change, not necessarily just as a problem. And I hope that this conference will contribute to that discussion further. Thank you.
And thank you for those remarks, Goran. Last but not least, I am here with Dr. Ingrid Hum from the Global Perspectives Initiatives. Ladies and gentlemen, please don't feel left out. We've not been able to shake hands, nor have we been able to embrace. We must also still be adhering to restrictions here. So Ingrid, your stake in this conversation now.
Yeah, we are here in Berlin in the middle of the second wave of Corona, and if we take one learning out of Corona, it's that the world will need more unity than ever. We need unity. So Africa, we learned in the film, and Goran emphasized it again, is suffering a lot of something that have not been caused in Africa, but they will find solutions. And we from Europe and from the neighboring continent, we should be extremely interested in them finding solutions, because there are so many potentials in that continent. And we are looking forward very much as Europe to cooperate with Africa in finding these potentials. I'm very happy that we have so interesting partners, so great partners in the foundation world with us today, and I'm as happy that we have been able to gather major voices from Africa, from Europe, from Washington, from the UN, to discuss the issues. And I'm sure that you can look forward very much to especially the African voices you will see next. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Ingrid. And she is quite right. You're going to be hearing from a lot of very active and prominent African voices, as well as European voices as well. I think it's an interesting time that we find ourselves in, just reporting on this continent and on the continent of Africa. You do get the sense that the language is more of cooperation, and it is in the spirit of cooperation between these two neighboring continents that we're having this conversation about what we do, about what many of us are tempted to call a challenge, but we need to see the opportunities in that. We're going to see the reality, and we're going to really show you just how much people are being displaced as a result of climate change. And you heard Ingrid and the others talk about the fact that Africa really is a victim in many ways in this context, but we're seeing a lot of stepping up and the assumption of responsibility. But how do we work together and forge the way forward? Now, for the next few minutes, you're going to be hearing from representatives from the EU and the AU. Our keynote addresses now. I'm going to introduce to you Jutta Urpilainen, who is the European Union Commissioner for International Partnerships. Her keynote address will be followed by that of Her Excellency Amira Al-Fadil Mohammed Al-Fadil, who is the Commissioner for Social Affairs at the African Union Commission.
Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, climate change and migration are two of the most critical and complex challenges of our times. Too often we tend to talk about them in binary, black and white terms. However, the migration climate change challenge is a complex and layered debate impacting people and planet. Some people move in search of a chance to start afresh. Some are forced to move to escape, and others are trapped where they are. So with this in mind, let me make 3 brief points on how the EU sees these challenges and addresses them in the context of our new EU-Africa partnership. Firstly, our ability to tackle climate change is our biggest test as a generation. Europe's answer to this is the Green Deal. The Green Deal is an ambitious and holistic growth strategy. If we get it right, we can address root causes of displacement in areas vulnerable to extreme weather, events like droughts and floods. Secondly, we intend to put our money where our mouth is when it comes to our priorities around climate change and migration. Our draft budget for the next financial cycle has innovative and higher spending on these 2 targets. Thirdly, under our financial framework, we will join forces with like-minded partners to drive real change on the ground. As Team Europe, our aim is to work more efficiently and inclusively with partners. This includes joint programming with member states on climate action, migration, and cooperation with partner countries. So how does our proposed new EU-Africa strategy fit into all of this? This strategy is about the EU and Africa joining forces in a solid, equal partnership to make the most of the green and the digital transformation. Together we can create decent jobs, good livelihoods, while also tackling climate change. Driving broader social and human development with new opportunities, especially for youth and women, is our starting point. From there, we will work together to ensure a balanced, coherent and comprehensive approach to migration and mobility. Most African migrants move within Africa. The challenge is therefore for many African partners to regulate and turn intracontinental mobility into an opportunity. Migration is a natural part of human development, one that creates opportunities for both Africa and Europe. Europe cannot manage migration on its own. We need to do this by cooperating with African partners based on trust, shared responsibility, and both sides' interests. Dear friends, it is time to let go of migration and mobility as words that evoke negative connotations. If well managed and regular and successfully tackling root causes of displacement in areas vulnerable to extreme weather events, we can create a wealth of opportunities. Thank you for your attention.
Excellency, Ms. Jota, AU Commissioner for International Partnerships, Excellency, Minister Amina Mohammed, Cabinet Secretary for Sports, Culture and Heritage, Kenya, Excellencies, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. I would like first of all to thank the organizers of this meeting for their kind invitation to me and to the African Union Commission. The COVID-19 pandemic has taught us the value of partnerships and cooperation. The partnerships between the European Union and the African Union is an enduring one, and the peoples of our Africa and Europe must work together to fight the pandemic, as well as collaborate for the prosperity and well-being of our two continents. So we need a continent-to-continent solidarity. Excellencies, the Paris Climate Accord highlights the impact of climate change on humanity. The agreement emphasizes that climate change represents an urgent and potentially irreversible threat to human societies and the planet. And according to the report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, Africa is the continent that will be most affected by climate change, although it contributes the least to it. Rural communities also, who are mostly dependent on agriculture, are particularly vulnerable. The Food and Agriculture Organization, FAO, estimates that the impact of climate change could lead to as much as a 50% fall of crop yields in some of the poorest African regions. The result of these climate change and the impact on communities and their livelihoods is forced migration and displacement migration as an adaptive response to climate stress is already apparent in many parts of Africa. For instance, in the Sahel region and in the Horn of Africa, youth in rural communities are forced to migrate to urban centers in search of opportunities to support their families. And when they don't find opportunities in the cities, they always try to migrate even out of the countries. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, climate change is both a driver of forced migration and conflict. Each of these dimensions typically reinforces the other, thereby creating a vicious circle. As we are aware, forced migration hinders development in several ways by increasing pressure on urban infrastructure and services, by undermining economic growth, by increasing the risk of conflict, and by leading to worse health, educational, and social indicators among migrants themselves. Excellencies, with the restrictions to mobility that are coming as a result, was happening as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, the negative impact of climate change on vulnerable communities has worsened. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, as I conclude, I would like to suggest 3 ways by which we can respond to the existential challenge posed by climate change and forced migration. First, the developed world must acknowledge its contribution to climate change and assume responsibility to support those who mostly impacted. Europe needs to not only think about cutting its carbon footprint, but support Africa to invest in creating opportunities for its young population, especially in education, health, entrepreneurship, and innovation in technology. Second, we must work together to increase the legal pathways for migration as one of the solutions. And these legal pathways to be into the European Union member states, and also to create opportunities for circular labor migration, and also to create opportunities for skilled or semi-skilled migrants. Moreover, the AU would need support from its valuable partners for the implementation of the protocol on the free movement of people, right of residence, rights of establishment. The third proposal is the new EU Migration and Asylum Pact must ensure that the rights of asylum seekers and migrants are not undermined, but are protected. Climate change and migration is still a politically sensitive subject of discussion in Europe, but climate-induced migration is a reality in Africa. But what I can end with is through the strategic partnership we have between the African Union and the European Union, we can continue the continent-to-continent dialogue, and we can always propose solutions to such kind of challenges and such kind of problems. Thank you very much for listening.
And a big thank you to Her Excellency Amira El Fadil Mohammed El Fadil, who was speaking for the African Union Commission. Before her was Jutta Urpilainen, who spoke for the EU Commission, just to the point about this being a conversation taking place between two questions. Earlier I asked where you were joining us from, and I do have those results for you, and I'm glad to say that a sizable chunk of the people in the audience today are joining us from Europe. About 86% of you are in Europe. We do have some representation from Africa as well. That's about another 10% of those taking part in the conversation. Asia is on the map as well, with just over 1% of our participants joining us from there. So I know that this is by no means a reflection of where an individual comes from, but it's just interesting to see the places that everybody is joining us from. So thank you so much for that. We will be regularly engaging you as we go. So I'm just hoping that by now you're sort of warming up into the conversations. You sort of heard from the European perspective what the expectations are, where the conversation is, and we heard also from the Commissioner, Her Excellency El Fadil, about what the expectations are in terms of the support that Africa is hoping for from its neighbor continent, Europe. At this point in the conversation, I want to introduce to you a lady by the name of Alexandra Bilak. Now, her and I can get into a thing where we could start going or having a bit of a conversation in Swahili. I would say to you, habari, Alexandra, and I can boast that because she does have a decade of experience working in Africa. She's been in places like Rwanda, Kenya, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. Now, she is currently with the director of the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center. You see why she fits into our conversation today. And she, of course, directs that organization. Her expertise really is on displacement in the context of armed conflict, violence, disasters, and climate change. Now, Alexandra has prepared a very quick presentation for us, just to lay out the facts and figures for us as we get into the conversation with our panelists. So, Alexandra, I do want to give the floor to you now. I've just noted to the audience that your expertise is, of course, in conflict and violence, as well as climate change. But as we were introduced to early in the conference, more people right now are displaced because of climate change as opposed to conflict and violence. So I guess I'll now give you the floor to give us more on the facts and the figures and the patterns of this phenomena.
Thank you very much, and good morning to all of you, and thank you so much to to the GPI team for having invited me to this event to present. Indeed, I've been asked as the director of IDMC, a global monitoring center following very closely the situation of people internally displaced by conflict, violence and disasters across the world. I've been asked to provide a contextual overview so that we can sort of place this conversation back in its context. Let me start by saying, perhaps by way of introduction, that Africa as a whole and sub-Saharan African countries in particular are undergoing unprecedented urbanization and economic and population growth, as has already been said, which has increased the number of people who are exposed to natural hazards. Unregulated and informal urban expansion, poor waste management, drainage systems in cities, and poverty in both rural and urban areas make people more vulnerable to the impacts of natural hazards. And the two factors together drive up disaster and displacement risk. Climate change is coming into this picture and is making natural hazards more intense and less predictable. We're seeing prolonged periods of drought. We're seeing above average rainfall and more powerful storms that are becoming more frequent. The impacts vary considerably within and between countries. With some notable exceptions, it tends to be small to medium-sized disasters that are triggering displacement. And these events often affect poor and marginalized communities with only limited capacities to prevent and to respond to the challenges that are brought on by these events. I would like to caveat my presentation by saying that the exact number of people who are internally displaced by climate change today in sub-Saharan Africa, or anywhere else in the world for that matter, is unknown. And the reason for this is that monitoring climate-related displacement is very challenging because it often occurs over a long period of time and because it's so hard to identify and to distinguish from voluntary forms of migration. So we can see and we can monitor the effects of certain climatic and environmental changes on people's livelihoods, but we're still not in a position to provide global data or even continental level data on such phenomena. My organization, IDMC, provides data and estimates of the number of people who are displaced by the more visible and documented impacts of weather-related hazards like floods, storms, and some droughts, as well as other geophysical disasters like earthquakes and volcanic eruptions. So please bear that in mind when you're looking at the numbers that I'm going to be presenting. Although displacement by conflict in Africa tends to receive much more attention, disasters do trigger every year millions of new displacements. We've recorded more than 21 million displacements between 2009 and 2018. In 2019, we recorded 3.4 million new displacements, which represents one of the highest figures ever reported for the region. The displacement was driven by unusually heavy rains, which caused widespread flooding in several countries. East Africa and the Horn experienced one of the wettest rainy seasons in 40 years. We also saw flooding along the White Nile Basin that forced many people who'd already been displaced by conflict to flee again. 2019, you'll recall, also saw Mozambique bear the brunt of both cyclones Idai and Kenneth, which triggered hundreds of thousands of displacements and destroyed homes, infrastructure, and crops. And in fact, in the countries that were affected, that include the Comoros, Madagascar, Malawi, and Zimbabwe, we're still seeing people who are still living in displacement today. Second slide, please. So hopefully you're seeing on this second slide an infographic that shows the main triggers of disaster displacement in Africa. As you'll see, although not the main one, drought is still a significant driver, but it's also a very underreported phenomenon. So our figures are likely to be significant underestimates. So far, we're only able to obtain data that is disaggregated by this hazard type for a few countries and only since 2017. Another key trigger of disaster displacement in Africa are tropical depressions or storms, with climate change now driving much more frequent, intense, and as I said earlier, less predictable events that have hit many African countries hard over the last few years. But you'll see from this infographic that the key driver, and the main one, of disaster displacement in Africa is floods, which account for 85% of all disaster displacement recorded there since 2009. Now, we've documented flood-related displacement across the whole of sub-Saharan Africa, and our data shows that these events are often recurring from year to year, and in fact that many displaced people who were still recovering from previous events or who may have already been living in displacement as a result of conflict or violence are then affected by flood displacement. To just give you a few examples, cities like Niamey or Freetown struggle with floods each year during the rainy season. In Freetown, we saw in August 2017 widespread flooding and a major landslide which destroyed homes and other urban infrastructure and triggered around 11,000 new displacements already. Then we saw 2 years later in August 2019 torrential rains and floods which destroyed another 450 homes, mainly in poor neighborhoods, and triggered another 5,000 or more new displacements. Now, what actually intensified the impacts of both events were largely the informal and the unregulated urban sprawl and the deforestation on the slopes surrounding the city. Another example comes from Nigeria and Maiduguri, where we've seen floods that have destroyed shelters that were already hosting thousands of IDPs in the city in August 2019. IDPs who'd been displaced by conflicts previously. And those floods and the destruction of those shelters contributed to the spread of cholera. In the state of Borno in Nigeria, more broadly, floods have affected people who have already been suffering the impacts of Boko Haram's insurgency and the activities of other non-state armed groups. So again, a large confluence of environmental, political factors affecting very vulnerable communities in very specific ways. And then a final example of flood displacement is, of course, from the Horn of Africa, Ethiopia, Kenya, and Somalia, where we see sudden onset hazards that often strike areas that were already previously affected by droughts. Heavy rain, floods have also affected agricultural production in Malawi recently after an extended period of droughts. And we see displacement associated with coastal erosion in less reported on, but it's less reported on, but it has been identified also across West Africa, where we see slow onset sea level rise and human factors combining with sudden onset events to like storm and tidal surges to create displacement. Third slide, please. Now, this third slide looks a little bit to the future. Now, to break the cycle of floods repeatedly triggering displacement in the same countries and the same communities, it's important to assess the likelihood and the potential scale of future flood displacement. Now, this phenomenon has to be seen as a risk, but it also has to be seen as a risk that can be mitigated. Longer-term development investments that include flood prevention and risk reduction are required, and for that, we need baseline data to inform them. So at IDMC, we've developed and improved a riverine flood displacement risk model. We did this in 2018 with the aim of creating a data set that could inform disaster risk reduction measures both nationally and regionally. Now, what the model does is that it has now much more granular data on population exposure, which gives a clearer sense of the people who are likely to be displaced by future riverine floods. And it estimates that on average, we can expect 2.8 million people to be displaced by such floods in Africa during any given year in the future. What the model shows is that highly populated countries like the DRC, Ethiopia, and Nigeria, unsurprisingly, have great flood displacement risk. Nigeria, for example, is at the confluence of two major West African rivers, which meet in the center of the country. And then you get heavy precipitation upstream in Cameroon, Mali, and Niger during the rainy season, which triggers flooding downriver, and hundreds of thousands of Nigerians are displaced each year as a result. So Nigeria has the highest flood displacement risk in Africa. But when this risk is looked at relative to population size, other countries come to light. Somalia, where 1 in 100 people could be displaced at any given year in the future, has the highest relative flood displacement risk on the continent. And other countries with high such risk include Chad, Congo, Liberia, and Madagascar. So the figures may appear high, but although they give a sense of the scale of the challenge to come in the future, they should also be considered underestimates, because our model only considers riverine flooding, which means that other phenomena such as flash floods and urban floods are not captured. In addition, the model uses the likelihood of housing destruction as a proxy indicator, whereas flood displacement risk is likely to be much higher in urban areas without adequate drainage and water management systems. The model also doesn't assess the role of rapid urban growth in increasing risk, because it works with current exposure data. So all of these are caveats. But even with these caveats, the evidence that the model produces can be used to inform national and local disaster risk reduction measures. It not only calculates national flood displacement risk, but it can also generate more granular figures to identify hotspots. So this information can be used as the basis for developing crisis prevention and management tools, contingency plans, and early warning systems. And in itself, it can really equip governments with the right kind of metrics to better plan and develop public policies. I'm going to end on this final slide, the fourth slide, coming back quickly to the issue of drought displacement. As I explained, this phenomenon is very hard to monitor, and we're looking precisely at a complex interaction of factors. Essentially, these are slow onset events that lead to food insecurity and directly affect environmentally based livelihoods like agriculture, pastoralism, or fisheries. So when communities are unable to cope with food insecurity, displacement becomes a survival strategy. We've recorded, for now, 1.6 million new displacements associated with drought between 2009 and 2018. But as I said, this data has only been obtained for just a few countries and only since very recently. Now, Somalia is one of the countries that we have focused on as part of our research on this topic. As you know, Somalia was on the verge of famine in 2017 after 4 consecutive seasons of droughts. Hundreds of thousands of people who were dependent on livestock and agriculture for survival were forced to abandon their rural homes and to move to urban areas to find new livelihood opportunities. So displacement associated with drought continued in 2018, with close to 250,000 new displacements reported. Most of these IDPs settled in informal urban settlements where the conditions were very poor and where forced evictions were and are still common. So we're seeing there cyclical forms of displacement and a repeated secondary, tertiary displacement as a result of these forced evictions. Now, we interviewed many of these IDPs as part of our research, and I just wanted to share some of the findings which pointed to a couple of key issues. One was of course, the difficulty for IDPs and indeed for local authorities in these contexts to consider return as a durable solution. When you're looking at livelihoods that have been destroyed as a result of the cumulative impacts of climatic and environmental changes, it's impossible to expect people to return to a type of livelihood that is no longer viable. Which is why I think in these contexts, the option of local integration needs to be looked at with much more detail and with much more deliberate focus. And when we talk about local integration, the issue of community dynamics also comes into play. And this is where the relationship between displaced communities and host communities is critical to make this local integration successful and to make it durable in the long term. So there are a lot of lessons to be learned from the research in Somalia, and indeed some of the research that we've carried out more recently in Ethiopia. This is a key issue that is also coming up in other parts of the world, in the Pacific region, where communities are having to be relocated away from coastal areas, mostly that are becoming uninhabitable, and where, of course, local integration is going to be a key priority. So many lessons to be learned from across the world that could be applied to the African context, but already a lot of interesting examples that can inform African peer-to-peer exchange and learning. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much, and I look forward to the discussion. Over to you.
Asante sana. Thank you, Alexandra Bilak. Yeah, and of course,
to practice my Swahili with you.
Absolutely, absolutely. You probably would do a better job teaching me at this stage. Okay, that is, of course,
I don't think so.
Alexandra Bilak. She is the director of the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center. And as she said there, I think one of my key takeaways from your presentation is that is only a glimpse of the real picture, right? We don't have the full picture, but already what we know is dire. So incredible work by the IDMC. They're trying to capture this data, on the premise of which we will be having the conversation further. Now, Alexandra will stay with us because she will be taking part in the next panel. I do want to introduce to you very quickly now some of the other participants who you will be hearing from now. Dr. Werkner Gebeyehu, he is the Executive Secretary of the Intergovernmental Authority on Development. You might otherwise know that as IGAD. Dr. Gabriel is a former minister in his homeland, Ethiopia, where he's held the office of Foreign Affairs Minister as well as Transport and Communication. Now, I can tell you that he knows a good thing or two about a good cup of coffee because he does come from Oromia, and we know that that region, farmers there grow some of the country, in fact, indeed, the world's best coffee. So great to have you on, Dr. Gebeyehu. We also have Natalie De La Palma. She is the Executive Director of the Mo Ibrahim Foundation. Now, Natalie has had a long career in civil service, having served the French government as an advisor for Africa. Ask her for your way around Grenoble, because that's where she was born. So skip the Paris and get to the true beauty of France. That's Natalie. And last but not least, we have Hindu Omar Ibrahim. She's an environmental activist, and she's been advocating for indigenous rights and environmental protection since the age of 16. And in 2016, Hindu spoke to world leaders at the United Nations headquarters. It was a gripping speech. I would encourage you, if you do get the time, to just go and listen to her impassioned remarks when you find some time later, of course, in the day. And that was around the time she'd been invited to give an address to world leaders when the Paris Agreement was having that ceremonial signing. Now, she grew up in Chad. She will tell us a little bit more about that when the conversation starts. And I know many of us consult our mobile devices when we check the weather leaving the house. But as Hindu will affirm, she grew up with one of the most reliable weather app services in the world. She says that's her grandma, Mama Ada. So welcome to you all, and I'm very excited to have you in this conversation. Hindu, I do want to start with you. Tell us a little bit about where you're from and how the livelihood of your community has been impacted by climate change.
Sure. Hi, everyone. It's really a great pleasure and honor to be with you. Thank you so much, Jonas, for the great introduction of all of us. Actually, Alexandra presented in a really broader pictures of how it's climate change impacting in all our countries. But as you said, I'm going to give you the example of my community and of Chad, of how we are living this climate impact that lead into the migrations. You know, I'm coming from a pastoral communities, and in my communities, we all depend from the rainfall. We depend from the environment and his various resources. And we live around the Lake Chad, where we saw his water shrink to the 90%. So there are farmers, pastoralists, and fisher peoples who are living around this place. And we all do not depend from the end of the month salaries, but we depend from the rainfall. So that's mean for us when we experience the climate change impact, we are seeing that in the season change, and it's translating into extreme weather event. And of course, Alexandra talked about how the floods and how the drought is coming in all those regions. So in my community, as you know, we move from one place to another one to find water and pastures. And while the season changed, like 2 years ago, even last year, it was a very dry season, up to 48 to 50 degrees Celsius. And that's mean for us, the rain season become not regular. And it's followed by a big drought that dry all the crops. And when it's dry the crops, it is also shrinking the water sources of the peoples where we can get access. And at the end of the day, the consequences are on the food security. because when you cannot grow up, it is all drying, so the food insecurity is stored. And then communities start fighting among each other to get access to the shrinking resources. And at that season, so you see exactly the relationship between man and woman and the response to the climate change. And it is the same like this year, so we get a very huge flood around all our regions. And also, as Alexandra said, from the town of Khartoum to Niamey to N'Djamena, even people are moving with canoe in the town. Car or motorbike cannot work at all. My own brother's home, he have to leave his family's outside and he have to be there just like to be a guardian to do not, does water flood all the rest of his stuff. So that's how we are experiencing that. So people's becoming homeless from the extreme weather events and the conflict among the communities start. So that's the one who lead to the migrations. We are talking maybe to the international migrations where there are numbers of the peoples killing themselves into Mediterraneans to join the Europe. But there are huge numbers of the peoples who are internal displaced, who have to move from one region to another one. And that creates the conflict among those communities who have to share the resources. And that is what we experienced last week in the south of Chad. When you have like thousands of cattle and you have hundreds of people fighting and then they dead, just because the rain season end and they wanted to move with the cattle, and then the agriculture people say like, no, this is our land, you cannot pass through it. So then they just fight and they kill each other. That is last week I'm talking about. So it is a reality for us. Climate change is devastating our life, killing our peoples, and making our young men and husbands leaving the communities to become a migrant. But who are left behind? They are women and children who are left as them on, and they are the most vulnerable because they cannot leave the entire community. You know, in those regions and in my communities, we live as a collective family, not only mom, that children that you can pack them and run away. No, you have your grandmother, you have your cousin, you have your nieces, your nephews. So at the end of the day, it's become a group of women, children, and all the peoples who are the most vulnerable and who are left in them on, who have to fight for them daily life to get food just for eating, or who have to fight to get just a clean water to drink, and who are also have to fight for them on security, because when the climate impact those regions, it's increased the poverty. And when poverty is increased, it is becoming a fertile land for the terror groups around all the Sahel. We are seeing the response to that terror groups. It's military response or humanitarian response. And those two, of course, they are very important, but they are not sustainable. Because why? If you do not tackle from the grass what is happening, you cannot get the response of what we are doing. So it needs to be the third pillars who can be the development, and this development must be based from the communities, and they can listen from them from the traditional knowledge that you already introduced in my presentations. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Hindu, for so eloquently just explaining to us, I mean, some of the imagery with your words, talking about how people are canoeing in towns where cars and bicycles are not able to be mobile because these places have been flooded. She talked about the impact on the way of life, men having to leave their homes in search of better prospects and leaving behind women. So this is obviously, as you speak, Hindu, we're getting a sense of just how this is your reality. It's something that many of us cannot begin to put our heads around, but that is what climate change is doing, the conflict that it's fueling. And I can attest to what Hindu is saying. Often in the media, we are reporting about communities that normally otherwise lived in harmony, now clashing because of the competing for resources. Hindu, keep in mind that I do want you to tell us about Lake Chad later on in the conversation. But at this stage, I would like to invite Dr. Gebeyehu into the conversation. I want to tell the audience that IGAD, the countries that fall under the group of IGAD, those are Sudan, South Sudan, Ethiopia, Kenya, Uganda, Somalia, and Djibouti. So Hindu has sort of given us a sort of Central Africa, West African perspective, perhaps. Dr. Gebeheyu, please go ahead and tell us about what you're seeing in your region.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, all of you. Very happy to be here, and thank you, moderator, for your introduction. Indeed, the panelists who intervened before me said it very well about the situation what we are facing in Africa, specifically the region which I'm living, as well as Central Africa, and indeed Africa as a whole, and to the maximum picture, the world. I know this is a political sensitive subject, but it is a reality for Africa. The reality because the data which Alexandra was talking about, and the facts that Hindu was mentioning about, and also the additional points that I'm going to add upon these areas. So there are a lot of debates and discussions on this area, but year to year, the climate change is indeed a real danger for humanity, specifically in all of the world, the continent, and specifically the region which I am living, that is IGAD. So some of local and regional perspectives on the situation of IGAD region. By the way, IGAD region is composed of 8 states, Eritrea, Ethiopia, Djibouti, South Sudan, Kenya, Uganda. So these countries are one of a very visible victims of the climate change that Alexandra was mentioning. Even 6 from 7 countries in IGAD, from the top 5, 3 of these countries are from my region that I am representing. 2/3 of the IGAD region is arid, as you know, and semi-arid, affected by many natural hazards, that is drought and flood, landslides, desertification and rainfall vulnerability. And also, as you know, IGAD is one of the highest concentrations of displaced population in the world. You may know that the data, we have 8.9 million IDPs and 3.9 million refugees in 2019, without fully counting 2020, which is a very difficult year that we have challenged as humanity, that definitely the impact of COVID have in all political, economic, and in our social aspects. We have experienced 2 major droughts. Just to bring to your attention, in 2011 up to 2012, affecting in our region, it's more than 30 million population in Ethiopia, Somalia, and Kenya. 2016 and 2017, it also affected over 15 million of people. So this data is increasing slowly, but surely we are accounting the number of population in terms of millions, 20, 30. We have not seen the decrease of data on this area. If we take some of the points that we as IGAD, we have our own monitoring, evaluating, and forecasting mechanism. That is our ICPAC center. That this region is how vulnerable I can mention for you. Temperature in Africa is projected to rise faster than the global average. If you take in Africa, specifically in the region that I am living, IGAD we are hitting up to by 3 degrees Celsius, which is twice as fast as the rest of the world. So you can see the magnitude of the problem in this region. As you know, in this year, 2020, we faced a triple threat in this region. COVID was there, and also the peace and security issue was there. The flood and locust, specifically to connect this thing with the climate change, the flood and the locust issue was a big challenge with COVID. So we were facing, because of that, the food security issue is also really a big challenge. So the challenge that the region is facing is not only this one. The sudden shift in the weather patterns has led to climate whiplash. That is extremely low weather levels during the season, followed by extremely high water level. During wet season can be observed in the Lake Victoria, Rift Valley, and the Nile region. So these challenges are going very fast. These challenges are very real. I can bring how many people have displaced because of flooding in this region. In this year, Sudan has witnessed a major devastating of flood, which they have never witnessed within these 100 years. And also Somalia, Ethiopia, as well as Djibouti and Kenya, all these are affected and displaced more than 3 million people because of the flood. So to conclude this thing, this is the real, tangible situation. A challenge is there. This challenge needs a common effort, as well as IGAD, we have recommendations that I can come back later on how to come to this point. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gebeheyu, just laying out the scene for us from the IGAD perspective. Natalie, I do want to rope you in to the conversation now, because as we've heard from Dr. Gebeheyu, COVID-19 has really come to sort of compound the hardships that already exist on the ground. He did talk about the invasion of the locusts as well. I remembered when we opened the year, that was the major threat to livelihoods this year. So now we're in the midst of a pandemic, Natalie, and I know at the Mo Ibrahim Foundation, you've been keeping track on the impact the pandemic has had on the continent. Just tell us a little bit about that and what you've observed from there.
Thank you very much indeed, and thank you to GPI for organizing this. Maybe if you allow me 3 points on what everybody has already said before, much better than I could do. I think indeed the link with COVID is very important, because climate change is not an African crisis like COVID. It's an external shock that impacts very heavily African livelihoods and African economy and social way of living. I'll come back to COVID after, but I think this first point is important. The second point that has been so much highlighted by Alexandra is when we come to the link between climate change and migrations, the first impact of climate change in Africa is IDPs. It's not migrants. And this is, I think, something that's important to remind to our non-African observers, listeners, and audiences, because I think that we need to be quite clear about the narrative on migration, especially when it comes to European public opinions. African migrants are not overwhelming European borders. This is not true. 80% of them are staying within Africa. African migrants are not triggered by crisis. They are triggered for 80% of them by looking for better economic and social prospects. African migrants are not sick and under-equipped people. Most of them are better educated on average than the ones that are staying behind. And we do have here a main challenge, which is the brain drain. And I really think once again that what we must consider is the impact first for African economies and social balance, rather than the impact on Europe. Having said that, and I very much like the fact that you were talking, Dr. Watney, about challenge rather than issue. I really think that this is an issue that a challenge that Europe and Africa can tackle together. I think, you know the saying, never let a crisis go to waste. And there is a huge opportunity to work on where we can see how to, indeed, between Europe and Africa, work together to address these challenges by sharing best practices, by sharing experiences, and by looking at potential prospects. In Europe, too, to a much lesser extent, we have, over the last years, known about droughts, storms, sea rises, landslides. We have also seen how much digital tools could help to warn and to tackle these challenges. And Alexandra has told a lot about this idea, this model that you have available. I really think that this is an opportunity together to see how we could work on careful mapping of risk, including satellite use, digital use, about also urbanization planning and launch management, because this is obviously key, about also infrastructure planning to make sure that whatever new infrastructure are being built on the continent, and we all know that there is still work to be done, so we are starting from scratch. It needs to include, indeed, the climate change impact and the ability to resist to climate change challenges. It's probably also an opportunity to strengthen regional cooperation. So once again, I really think that, even if without any doubt, we need to take care and to consider together how to immediately patch up the immediate impact on livelihoods of people who are living in these zones. But ahead of that, we can also probably find great opportunities in working together on planning, mitigating, and preventing all these risks. Now, just to finish on your question, Jonas, and thank you for this on COVID, because it has similarity to climate change. Once again, COVID is a global crisis that has been imported to Africa. As far as we can see, for the time being, it seems that the health impact is staying limited. I would be cautious about that because the wave is still rising in Africa. And to be quite frank, we don't really have strong enough data. But the worst impact is economic and social. Economies have come to a complete standstill. Recession is predicted in Africa for the first time since the last 25 years, especially when you look at marginalized and fragile communities. There's really a risk for livelihood. Quite a lot of small and medium enterprises have disappeared because African growth is mainly, in many countries, built on exports of commodities. They have been destroyed. And this is really something we must look at, because nobody will come out of this global crisis if Africa doesn't come out of it, be it on health level or economic level. So I think this is something to really consider. And I would say it's exactly the same kind of analysis that applies to climate change. It's a shared crisis that's calling for shared solutions. Thank you.
That's right. Thank you so much for that, Natalie. And I guess, Dr. Gebeheyu, I do want to bring you back into the conversation right now, because we've left off on this note about the coronavirus pandemic. I wondered if in the region, how you had observed the closing of the borders, some of the restrictions that have come with our way of tackling the COVID-19 pandemic. How has that impacted the climate change migration? We've heard that most people that are migrating in Africa are staying on the continent. 80% was the figure. So from an IGAD perspective, how have you seen border closures impact movement, climate-induced movement in the region? Dr. Gebeheyu.
Thank you very much, moderator. Yes, the point that now you mentioned very critical, especially for the region. As Indu said, this region also, the region that we are living, specifically the Horn of Africa, is the pastoralist area. These pastoralists cross borders. They don't know borders. Actually, they run beyond their cattle and their animals. So because of this challenge, the borders indeed has closed, and it was not only a challenge in terms of health, but a challenge for their livelihood, because they cannot move from one area to the other area to find water and grass for their animals. That is a real challenge. Finally, the other thing is these two border areas, they are most of places, either in Somalia, in Kenya, Ethiopia, or Sudan. They are from the same family and the same tribes. So they have a friendship or family across the borders. So because of this challenge, indeed, that was one of the most vulnerable areas that we have identified as IGAD, and we worked on it. We worked on this area that, we try to share masks, we try to establish a border checking points, and a point that health workers were dispatched at this area as well. So this is a challenge that we have faced. Not only that, the COVID-19 crisis was for this region, when we bring it together with other issues, the displacement that we have in the Horn of Africa, the unemployment that we have in this region, and the number of users that Africa have. We have almost more than 70% of the users. Most of them are unemployed. So the migration, internal displacement has really increased because of this. So now, I cannot separate one from the other, because these are highly complicated and coming together. As Natalie said, that the most vulnerable are not the migrants also. These are internally displaced people who are facing these challenges. This is a very important word that I'm taking. So you cannot solve one thing and you cannot leave the other. The COVID issue, the climate problem, the food security, as well as specifically in our region, the peace and security issue. These are a combined challenges that we are living in. In fact, we are trying to challenge again.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. Hindu, stand by. I did want to come to you first, but there is a very interesting question that's come in from Martin Schmidt in Brussels. He's talking about the fact that if IDPs often have no reason to return because they cannot build a new livelihood in the region they've left, can this be applied to all of migration? I guess I'll bring this to you, Alexandra. We've talked about the fact that many of the IDPs have no reason to return because they can't build a new livelihood. So there is this proposed new pact on migration and asylum that has come from the European Union. Is that simply just going to result in repetitive migration, Alexandra?
Thanks very much, Christine. I'm not sure I've fully understood the question. The point I was making was indeed to perhaps dissipate a little bit of the misconceptions that we often hear that that return is the only solution to displacement. And indeed, return is often the preferred solution, certainly one that most governments and even UN agencies will tend to favor over others. And it's true that in the majority of cases, if you look across the world, return is also the preferred solution for refugees and IDPs themselves. Of course, in an ideal scenario, you would want to be able to go back to your area of origin, to your home, to rebuild and to recover in the place where you were born, maybe, or where you grew up. Now, the point I was making earlier was just to reinforce the fact that in many cases now, with the impacts of climate change, that return is no longer going to be possible. And this, again, to sort of echo what Natalie was saying about how to turn a crisis into an opportunity, this could also be an opportunity to explore the option of local integration more fully, to put in place the mechanisms and to look into what kinds of investments are needed from the local level all the way to the national level to make that local integration possible. Local integration is an option that is not generally, I'm not saying that it's not favored, but it's just not really invested in much. There's very little information out there on best practices. How can we make local integration a success? How can we then work on social cohesion, on building up that cohesion with host communities? We're often looking at problematic community dynamics, as was mentioned when we're looking at a struggle around resources. So it does provide an opportunity to think through what is needed to put in place social, political, and economic conditions that will be then conducive to longer term solutions. I wouldn't say that that's necessarily the case in the that should be looked at as a blanket approach throughout Africa, but certainly it's very relevant in some contexts.
All right, thank you for that. Natalie, here's one for you. Somebody has anonymously given us the question here that it has been pointed out by a number of panelists, we heard it in the keynote addresses as well, that climate-induced migration is politically sensitive. Why is it the case? Why is the topic politically sensitive, Natalie?
I don't have a complete answer to that, but I would say because we are probably mixing two politically sensitive topics. One is climate change and the other is migration. Let's talk about Europe and Africa. When we talk about climate change, we all know that there is a debate around climate change, which is people saying we must take into account climate change and go immediately to clean energy. And on the other side, people saying, yes, but we need to develop. We need access to energy. We need energy to develop. And we just don't have the means to go to clean energy immediately. When you did the Industrial Revolution in Europe, energy wasn't clean. And you just didn't care about clean energy. So we need to balance this need for development and need for clean energy. And this is, I think, one of the key discussions that are going on currently between Europe and Africa. And it's going on a much more constructive way. And I really think that we are there beginning to build something that could be a win-win process both for Europe and Africa. We must never forget that we are living in two neighboring continents. We are sharing the same space and we are sharing the same challenges. So we need to define, I would say, common solutions that are mutually profitable and beneficial. Migration is the same. Once again, it's not African migration against Europe's security and stability. Once again, let's come back to figures. And let's really be factual about this. And let's also consider that you have two continents. One is an aging one is a very young one. So if only the demographic balance between the two continents is something that must be taken into account. And there too, we must work together on something that's mutually beneficial. And there too, I hope, and I really believe that we can get there, provided indeed, and I'm coming back to something Alexandra and Dr. Workney said, let's work on the right data. Because if you don't have the right data, you can't you can't define sound policies, you can't take the right decisions, and you can't monitor whether they are effectively implemented. So this is why I think this might explain, it doesn't explain all of it, but this is why indeed it can appear for the time being as a conflicting or debate. Thank you.
I just do want to point out to some of those, those who are attending that we aren't talking solutions just yet. That conversation is following in our next panel. We're using this opportunity to really establish what we're dealing with, and just coming off of what Natalie has been advocating for. We need the facts, we need the numbers, so we know exactly what we're up against. So don't fret. We are going to be talking about the solutions as we get into the next panel, and of course the cooperation that we will be also discussing between Europe and Africa, and in fact global efforts. We'll be talking about that as well in the conversation that comes tomorrow. Hindu, I did say that I've been dying to get back to you, more specifically just about Lake Chad, for example. Now, you have spoken about nature and how you grew up relating with nature. You said that nature was your supermarket, that it was your pharmacy, that it was your school. We've been talking a lot about how people's livelihoods have been impacted, but we're losing so much in terms of the resource that nature is. Just talk to us about how much we stand to lose if we do not get to addressing this climate change situation.
Right, completely. So when we look at from the data, we are seeing that our world is lose more than 60% of the species. And of course, so we are seeing how the climate is accelerating. Like when we say Paris Agreement, we need to start on 1.5 degree. We already in Chad have the 1.5 degree from the research side. Since 99 to now, we already increased 1.5 degree. So those two are a reality in the ground. And the example is around the Lake Chad. You know, in 1960, when my mom get born, the Lake Chad was 25,000 kilometers squares. And she is alive. She's 1960 born. When I get born around 1980, the Lake Chad was 10,000. So then actually now it is around 2000s. So you see like 90% of the water just like evaporated. So for us, it is a reality when we talk about the climate change and about losing the biodiversity. You know, when I was young, I used to play with the colorful bears. This is the one I have in my mind, in my eyes, that I will never forget. Those colorful birds that we play with I do not see them anymore. They just like disappear. And there are a lot of grass, a lot of insects, a lot of things that just disappears, that the one I can monitor myself. And that when we come in the numbers, it is not just a report, it is not just a TV show, it is a reality that the peoples are living on it. So that's how we are seeing the natural resources are just disappearing. And that's impact the life of the peoples. As human beings, we have to remember we are only one species of the nature. As the insect, as the birds, as the trees, we are not like the dominant of the other insect. So that's why we need to rebuild the balance between us and the nature, between us with the rest of the species. We need to respect each other. And if we do not rebuild that, we are going to lose what we have the most, our human species. So that's why from indigenous perspective, we always say nature is everything that we have, because nature is the one who are giving us food, giving us medicine. Even the medicine in the pharmacy, 70% of it coming from the nature, and then maybe 30% that from the chemical things that they are adding on it. But the expressions and all the substance are coming from nature, and food are coming from nature. Even you are in the town, even you are going to the Mars, you have to use the nature to put the food in your tables. Clean air are coming from nature. And if you do not protect your forest, you can have the pollution in the cities, and that can impact your air. And if you do not protect nature, you cannot get a clean water to drink. So we all rely to this nature that we are destroying. And that's why it's become to this illegality, injustice between developed and developing countries. We are saying that, and then Natalie lied down very well, because if the developed countries who use the resources abuse on it, if they cannot take any step to stop all the coal mine, the fossil fuel, if they cannot take this step to rebuild the relationship with the nature, we are the one who are suffering. We didn't benefit from it. We are suffering. This is unjust. We need to create this justice, and then we can fight the migrations and rebuild up the relationship with the nature. If we protect nature, nature will protect our health back, and that can apply to the COVID-19 too.
Yeah, thank you so much. And Hindu, before I let you go, before we sum this up, I have a question for you, and I guess it is a question that we had posed on the panel. We're asking, are we at a point of no return? Where do you stand on that, Hindu? You've stood before world leaders, as I told the audience earlier on, saying what you're telling us today. Do you get the sense that we're at a place of no return when it comes to the climate crisis?
I think this is the most sad questions that really, like, always when I have it, I feel so bad. Maybe if we didn't act now, right now, we will be the generation who will turn the button of no return. Yeah. Because we all said, if we exceed the 1.5 degree around all the rest of the world, we are going to extend so many things in our life. So suddenly we have a window of opportunity from now to the next 9 years or 10 years to increase all the ambitions and act now. If we didn't do that, we are going to do this no return point. And I don't want to be part of these communities of no return peoples. That's why I am acting. And I hope that all the audience, you can stand up and do your best to really do not go to this no return way.
Thank you so much for that, Hindu. And I guess that is really the closing note of this panel, that we've laid out the challenges, but I'm hearing from Hindu that we can still salvage this, that we can still take the efforts that are needed. You sort of alluded to the Sustainable Development Goals. We have 10 years to realize some of those goals and to perhaps stop some of the developments that we're seeing rapidly taking place. Thank you again to my panelists. I would just want to say to you, Dr. Worknegebeheyu, thank you for your contribution. He spoke for IGAD. Natalie De La Palma was speaking for the Mo Ibrahim Foundation. Thank you very much for your insight. Alexandra Bilak came to us from the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center. Thank you so much for that. And of course, Hindu Omar Ibrahim, thank you for giving us this perspective and for refreshing us and for giving us a call to action. From myself and the team here in Berlin, we thank you so much for having spent this part of your day with us. We really hope that it's been meaningful. Thank you for the questions that have been coming in. Some of those questions we will be directing into the next panels because they fit more thematically with that. Thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure having you along. From myself and the team, see you later. Goodbye.